this is the bit that we're doing together, is you're going to carry between you, you're going to carry your mum or your dad or your wife's coffin. And that seemingly unbelievably simple act does create an emotional muscle memory. It does just it brings you into the moment, because it's so easy in a funeral to find yourself floating, 10 foot above, completely removed from it in a state of numb shock.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Rupert Callender is my guest today. He's the owner of the Green Funeral Company based in the UK, and together with his partner is providing unique, highly personalized funeral services. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode is sponsored by Hospice Navigation Services. When end-of-life care becomes confusing or overwhelming, Hospice Navigation Services can help. Hospice navigators are hospice professionals with at least 10 years of hospice experience, trained to provide accurate, unbiased information. Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Now, here's today's episode.
So today marks a first for the podcast. I have never had an undertaker on the show. And I do mean undertaker. I'm not using it as slang for funeral home director, funeral director, none of that. This gentleman, Mr. Rupert Callender, is an undertaker, and that's how he identifies himself. He's the co-owner of the Green Funeral Company. He's also the author of What Remains, a book about his undertaking experiences, which is coming out in March of 2023. Rupert has a unique philosophy when it comes to the care of the dead and the care of the family, wanting to capture the true essence of those who have died. He's also done a TEDx talk called Death, Grief, Ritual, and Radical Funerals. In fact, he calls himself a radical undertaker, and you're going to see why, you're going to hear why, when you listen to my conversation with today's guest, Mr. Rupert Callender. Rupert, welcome to the podcast. It's awesome to get to talk to you today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Helen. It's really thrilling to be here.
So let's lead in with a question about how you describe yourself. You call yourself in the book, What Remains, a radical undertaker, which is a little scary, actually, undertaker and radical put together. But tell me what that means to you.
Well, I mean, as you rightly seen, just the use of the word undertaker is quite controversial, really. And I always decided that I was going to call myself an undertaker rather than a funeral director. And of course, the etymology of the word, it comes not from taking someone under the ground, as people assume, but it's a pledge that you undertake. You undertake to help the living by dealing with the dead. So that's why I wanted to call myself an undertaker. And why I've always described myself as radical was, I feel that even 20 years ago, but particularly now, the term radical has got really bad connotations. It's kind of associated with extremism and violence. And I call myself a radical because I want to acknowledge the debt that I personally owe to a kind of long line of progressive alternative movements, some of them the counterculture. So, I was born in 1970, but my sister is much older, so I had a lot of kind of the hippie ethos instilled in me. And I've got a lot of admiration for the, particularly the way that it happened in America, the kind of hippie movement and the anti-war movement and the counterculture in general. But I take it, I think it goes back further. I think there's a kind of line of progressive, what I call social ancestors for me, going back through all the way to the Quakers, back down through people like the Levelers in Britain who were, about trying to reclaim common land, which is a battle that's going on now. Right now, here in Devon, in Dartmoor, there's a similar battle to try and reclaim rights for the people over the land. So, and people like the diggers, the English diggers, who were challenging the kind of sort of existing feudal norms there, and also the San Francisco Diggers, the performance art activist group in Haight-Ashbury in the 60s, who kind of took it upon themselves to look after the influx of largely teenage runaway hippies that suddenly filled San Francisco. But I just feel there's a kind of there's a lineage that I wanted to acknowledge in what I do, and that I'm not the idea. The way I practice as an undertaker hasn't sprung from nothing. It's sprung from a rich tradition of what I'd call radical dissent. And a lot of those radical dissenters, of course, were religious. The Shakers and the Quakers and Anabaptists and all of these people who tried to take the kind of kernel of what they saw as the religious truth and do it a different way from the establishment. So describing myself as radical was really, it was planting my flag in the soil and going, this is where I come from, and this is how I intend to move these ideas into undertaking.
When I hear you describe what the word undertaker means, it has for me this commitment to a family. It says, I'm here to partner with you, to undertake this task with you and walk with you while we do it. And that is the basic foundation of the kind of care you provide, isn't it? With the Green Funeral Company.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we try to do. So we, from the offset, myself and my ex-partner Claire, who worked with me for 20 years, we did decide that we were going to try and engage with people in a much deeper way, and not come dressed in intimidating formal clothes, and not come with a somber expression, and not come in with a kind of catalogue of coffins or flower arrangings or things like that. We just thought that we would treat these people as I knew from my own experiences, who are bewildered by grief and absolutely disconnected from reality, and try and join them in that unreality, and have half of us in reality and half in their reality, and make a kind of deep commitment to them to go, okay, we will get you as far, we can't get you all the way to the end of pain, but we can get you through this bit, and we can do this bit, and if it's done right, it's like resetting a broken bone, and that's what we can do with you, and we will be with you throughout that bit, and however we decide to do it, we'll do it together. So yeah, it is a real commitment. It's a pledge. So
you came to this philosophy fairly early in your 20s through after an experience when your mom died.
Yeah, I had a lot of early bereavement as a child. My dad died when I was 7, and then within 6 months, my 2 surviving grandparents died, and then an aunt died, and all of these were, I kind of compartmentalized the experience of not going to those funerals. I compartmentalized them aside, and then my mum got ill when I was about 20. She developed cancer, and she went on that. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, Helen. The kind of roller coaster of initial diagnosis, and then horror and catastrophizing, and then treatment and remission. And it was a long journey. It was about 4 years, and I was literally 20 when she was diagnosed. So I kind of got used to that roller coaster. So when she did die, when I was 25, I was thunderstruck, really, and went into deep existential shock for quite a long time, and then realised that really what I was starting to feel were the effects of all my unfelt bereavements. They all kind of came rushing in, and I suddenly realised that I hadn't really grieved my father properly. And it took me a long time to grieve my mother. I cried. She died. As you know, she worked in a hospice back when I was a child. Massively formative experience for her, and she died in a hospice, a different hospice. But she died in a hospice, and she wasn't there for that long, probably only about 4 days, I think. But she felt very, very comfortable being there. It felt very familiar. And she immediately engaged with the staff on a kind of staff level, really, and started to kind of worry about the various runnings of things in a very, very thoughtful way. She just couldn't help herself. But I saw her the night before she died, and that was really shocking for me. We had a conversation, not much of which I can remember, but she said, "I'm not going to die tonight, but I'm going to die tomorrow." And she did. And I cried on the way back from seeing her that night. And then I didn't cry again for about probably 8 months or so. I went into that much of a state of numbness about it. So it was a really formative experience for me, her death. And then when I discovered, I saw a guy called Nicholas Albury on the television talking about the Natural Death Centre. This was about 4 years later, describing how you didn't need to have a license to be an undertaker or a funeral director, that in fact the family really were legally the funeral directors, and that there was a completely new way of doing things, a lot of which was informed by his experience in the counterculture. That, I had a light bulb moment and just went, oh my God, I'm an undertaker. I'm going to be an undertaker. I'm going to do everything for families that wasn't done for me. I came from a position of knowing what not to do, which is can be as powerful and as strong as knowing what to do, really, if you start off from that position. So, my mum's death was a big thing. 27 years ago, she died. So it was a long time.
Rupert, what was your mother's name?
She was called Roz.
Roz.
Yeah, Rosemary. Roz.
I think it's important to remember those who are important to us by name like that. So Roz had a lot of maternal influence, even through her funeral. One of the things you've written about in the book is that she completely planned everything. Yeah,
she did.
You and your sisters didn't have to do anything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think probably just choose a coffin, really. My stepfather had to choose a coffin. Yeah, I think she wrote probably just after I'd left. She saw all of us, and then probably after we left, she wrote down her funeral plans, which she'd been, she wrote at the top of the list, she wrote "Bossy Boots still at it."
I saw that. I tagged that in the book because I thought that was hilarious. And, we talk a lot about pre-planning and what do you want and advanced care planning. And that's a huge dialogue inside hospice care with our patients and their families. But you came to the conclusion through your own personal experience that takes something from the family. It removes them just another degree from what's going on.
Yeah, it absolutely can. My mum chose everything. She chose the music, the readings, who was going to speak, who was going to do the eulogy, and it was all the right people and the right choices. But it did completely remove any opportunity for us to kind of go, well, how would, maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. It was a very different form of experience with a funeral director than I offer. It was the opposite, really. I didn't meet, my stepfather probably chose a coffin, might have gone in to meet them. I'm not entirely sure he did. It must have been very straightforward for the funeral director. There was the kind of normal, the grave plot in the churchyard to sort out and orders of service and things like that. But no, I don't even actually remember meeting anybody who said they were the official funeral director. I just got in a limo to drive the ridiculously short distance from my mother's house to the church, which was literally about 200 yards. And the bearers carried her coffin in, and everything happened that she wanted to happen. But there was no kind of input from us. Not that, to be perfectly honest, I was in much of a position to give input, really.
Sure.
But now, the way I handle families, I meet people who I kind of go, okay, that's me. That's either me, the 7-year-old who was excluded from their father's funeral, or that's me, the kind of numb, slightly immature 25-year-old who isn't going to be asked their opinion about it, and just try and kind of bring them in, really, in a way which I wasn't.
So when you said that they were the right people for the services, the music, the speakers,
Yes.
so was it the right people for your mom, or was it the right people for you and your family? Because there's a difference.
There is a difference. There is a real big difference. I mean, actually, in this case, it overlapped. It was the right people for her, and it was the right people for us. The person who gave the eulogy was her oldest friend, who'd known her since she was 4, her oldest and best friend. So it was entirely appropriate that she gave the eulogy, and the music was just perfect. It was Jan Garbarek. I took up the runes, which is beautiful, haunting oboe. Jazz kind of oboe, and it was faultless. I don't think we could have done a better thing, but it would have been helpful to have kind of come to those things ourselves, really. And also, she had a service in the village church. She was an atheist, but if she'd known about what I do now, which I didn't know about for a further 4 years, I think she would have definitely changed her mind, really. And had something a lot more secular that reflected her beliefs.
Yeah, something more representative of who she was.
Yeah, I mean, she was absolutely represented perfectly. It was stage managed. Everything was wonderful about it in terms of how her life was brought and offered, as it were. But the detail, the thing which really struck me, which has a big effect on the way that we work, is the bearers, the professional bearers who bore her coffin out of the church and put her in the hearse, and then we walked behind the hearse to the churchyard, which was about half a mile away, and then did all of the mechanics of the actual kind of burial. And I was left, we were all left on the sort of outside, really. You can't get close to the actual moment, the big event, which is the coffin going down into a grave or into a furnace. It was sort of slightly hijacked by very, very solemn looking old men who happened to be the same height, so they could carry the coffin. And that was, that really struck me at the time. There was a lot of pantomime. There was a lot of things done for us which we should have done, really. And now it's more common for family to get involved in the simple things like carrying the coffin. But then she bought a funeral off the peg, as it were. So this was just what happened. We were never asked if we'd like to carry the coffin.
Right. So it was an off the rack, ready made.
I think so. Yeah, ready made. And I'm sure she did it for the reasons that a lot of people do it, which is thinking that you are going to be helping in that sort of bardo state of in between somebody dying and the funeral, that it was just one more thing that we didn't have to worry about. But actually, it would have been really, really useful to construct it ourselves, and it would have helped us kind of bond as a family a bit more, because we all slightly went off into our own isolated pockets of grief, really, and being forced to get together and create a ceremony from scratch would have really helped.
Yes. I like the idea of creating something in a moment of grief, intense grief right after a death. You even talked about what carrying the casket creates. You talked about it in the book, that it creates muscle memory.
Yeah, absolutely. It does create muscle memory. People are always... So the coffins that I use are all environmentally friendly. And I don't have an enormous range. I don't have a big, leather-bound brochure that you can spend. It's a bit different in the States than it is over here. But you can still spend a lot of money on polished mahogany and things like that. Mm-hmm. My coffins are very simple. Then most of the time, the ones I use are cardboard. But and I use quite a lot of willow as well, which has grown just up the 20 miles up the road. Willow woven coffins, which are probably the most traditional of all, because the Romans were buried in willow coffins. and possibly the Celts before them. But the key thing is they have handles that work, and we don't employ bearers. I work with a colleague now, and previously when I worked with my ex-partner, there was always just two of us. So on a practical level, we need help with the coffin. So the family kind of have to. I think maybe one funeral in 23 years we've had to get in bearers, or get the grave diggers to help us because somebody who's died has been too old and But generally, that's our kind of that's one of our calling cards, is going, okay, so this is part of when we say doing it together. This is the bit that we're doing together. Is you're going to carry between you. You're going to carry your mum or your dad or your wife's coffin, and that seemingly unbelievably simple act does create an emotional muscle memory. It does just it brings you into the moment, because it's so easy in a funeral to find yourself floating, 10 foot above, completely removed from it in a state of numb shock.
Sure.
Whereas if you have to go, oh wow, that's heavy, and people are always surprised by how heavy the dead are, physically heavy the dead are, and by reminding them and going, yeah, this is what you're going to do. I think it's a simple but profound thing. Nobody has ever said, I wish I hadn't have done that.
So nobody has ever said, I wish that had never happened, that I hadn't participated.
No. I mean, the thing is, with a burial, it's particularly raw, really. There's no getting away from it. There's a hole in the ground that, grave diggers call it a hole before a coffin is lowered into it, and then it's a grave. So there's a kind of moment almost of transubstantiation where this simple hole becomes something more. And it's incredibly powerful, and it's distressing. There's no doubt about it. It's a really hard thing to see. But if you can actually see it or be part of it, instead of being removed by and separated by this kind of phalanx of besuited professionals, then it is the moment that it really bites home, and it's hard. And it's not meant to be forcing people to look at something they don't want to. It's just kind of bringing them into the moment and going, this is really happening. We are really doing this. It is your father in that box, and we are putting him in the ground, and we are going to, together, we're going to shovel the earth back on. And that's going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done, but you will be grateful for it in however many years' time.
And so meaningful that it's a we activity. We're doing it together.
Absolutely.
It's a companioning. Absolutely.
Completely a companioning. And the idea of separating, that was why we never wanted to be described as professionals, even though I hope we are quite professional. We want to be described as kind of skilled amateurs. So just to break down those kind of barriers between, we're the people who know what funerals are, and you're the people who are going through it. Just mix that all up and go, we'll all go through it. Obviously, we're not experiencing the same amount of emotional pain that they are, but the amount of time we spend with a family, hopefully with the body as well, we do kind of become what someone once described my ex-partner. They introduced my ex-partner as my temporary best friend. And it's that kind of, that's kind of what we're aiming for.
Yes.
But it's not, and I have I've made friends now. Some of my best friends I've made through funerals, but it's not a kind of, we're not making a false commitment going, we are going to be your friends forever. We're like, we're here in this moment, and we can do this for you, and we're going to be much more engaged than an ordinary funeral professional would.
This episode is sponsored by Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Navigating end-of-life care can be confusing and overwhelming. Hospice Navigation Services can help you navigate hospice care for the best end-of-life experience possible. Hospice navigators are hospice professionals with at least 10 years of hospice experience, trained to provide accurate, unbiased information. Our team's compassion and respect for quality of life allows them to help you focus on getting the kind of care you want. When you need in-depth information about hospice, a Level 1 navigation session can provide information on what hospice care includes, roles of the team members, and how to choose a hospice agency. A Level 2 session is the best choice if you want to include multiple members of your family or caregiving village, and includes an explanation of hospice costs and coverage. If you have specific questions about a current hospice experience, a question and answer session with a hospice navigator can give you the answers you need. Watch for the launch of the Hospice Navigation Services in the spring of 2023. Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Now, back to the conversation.
The tenets that you have for your services are honesty, appropriateness, and participation.
Yeah.
Yes. How does each one of those things show up in the way you care for the dead and for their loved ones?
Well, the participation bit, obviously, in the, as I've talked about, in the most practical sense, is the kind of carrying and lowering of the coffin, but also it's about not being a gatekeeper, not being as much of a gatekeeper between the living and the dead as normally happens. The appropriateness is just going, we need to find out who this person is so we can decide how we are going to create a ceremony. And the honesty is, I suppose that comes back to things like, on an aesthetic level, an emotionally aesthetic level, embalming. We don't embalm at all, not just because we consider the chemicals involved to be absolutely horrendous, but because I think there's a deep psychological disconnect when you see somebody well embalmed and when you see them dead. So the honesty is about trying to not pull the wool over anyone's eyes and being very honest about what happens to a body, because sometimes it would be quite distressing to see bodies. Sometimes it is very distressing to see bodies, and it's about the honesty is going, okay, well, this is the condition they're in. This is what's happened. They've had years of various chemotherapies and radiotherapies. They've been had cancer for a long time. Their body is ready to go, and to come and see them now is really a good idea, because maybe in a week's time their body really might be ready to go. So it's just about trying to be completely transparent about it and not have any sort of Obviously, we have a kind of backstage. I have a mortuary fridge, and a very simple mortuary, and a chapel of rest. But it's about just explaining to people what it's going to feel like to see this person, particularly if they weren't there when they died.
Right.
And just trying to answer as many questions truthfully as possible, really. Sometimes it's not possible. I once negotiated between a woman who rang up, whose mother had died and not been found for quite a long time. And she wanted to see her body. And the undertaker that she was using wouldn't let her. And he was very much kind of old school. And she rang us up and wanted us to kind of help. And so we did. We talked to both of them. And the undertaker was going, look, this body is kind of beyond a body now.
Right.
And I went back to the woman and explained that to her. She went, yeah, I still have a very, very powerful need to see her, whatever state she's in. So, that's the kind of level of honesty that we're kind of aiming for. But it's a very fine line about how you train it, because you don't want to upset people unnecessarily. But you do want people to be able to, if possible, to have that experience, have the time spent with somebody who has died, which can be a deeply sacred experience, and really is part of settling into the head and the heart that this has actually happened, that this person has died. Because it's, as you know, it's such an unreal experience. And it doesn't matter how prepared you think you are, or how much you've anticipated, or even how much anticipatory grief you've gone through. When it actually happens, it's just like someone letting off a flash bulb in your face. It's numbing, completely numbing. So it's just trying to keep that balance between being honest without being gratuitous or cruel, and just kind of treading a very fine line and going, okay, this person probably doesn't need to see them as they are, or this person really needs to see them. So it's constantly adjusting it, really, but also just trying not to hide behind the trappings, particularly of the sort of traditional British funeral, which is very formalised and very, I use the phrase faux Victoriana in the book, and it's very much that, and that can be a kind of a curtain to keep you away from anything that's really happening. And some of the larger funeral companies who have hubs where they keep bodies in, and a family might pop in and go, "Can I see my dad?" And they panic a bit because they let people assume that their dad is on the premises, and of course their body's not. They're in a body hub, so the logistics of getting them in is tricky. So they sometimes lie. Rather than going, actually, your dad's not here, but we can organise him to come here. So it's about trying to go, yeah, we're not doing that. We're not hiding behind any kind of capes or best practice. We're just trying to be honest about what's going on.
It's a wonderful way to connect and carry a family through something like this. It truly is. So I want to switch our focus a little bit.
Of course.
We're going to talk about you a little bit. When it comes to caring for the dead and caring for their families, what challenges you the most in the work that you do?
Grief. It's definitely grief. I think, I talk about in the book that I am not okay with death. And I've never been okay with death. So, my father walked out the door to work and never came home again. And that completely robs you of any of that sense of kind of immortality that, teenagers who haven't gone through it feel. So I'm frightened of death on a kind of existential level, and also on a kind of how it might happen level. But it's not death that I find the most difficult around this work. It's grief, and that's the thing I also fear the most is grief, really. So being around incredibly distressed parents whose children have died in any manner of tragic circumstances, it's unbelievably hard to hold yourself in that moment and be what you are. There's a book, I imagine you might have heard of it, called Intimate Death by Maria de Hennezel, who is it's about 20 years old now. She's a French psychologist who worked in 2 hospices in Paris, one an AIDS, specifically an AIDS hospice, and another a general hospice, which is nearly always cancer. And she describes a scene of great distress of a woman who's been admitted, who's dying, but her daughter won't let her say that. And the psychologist walks in, Maria walks in, and she says it's like a little scene of hell. But there is this candle flame of reassurance, which is the hospice nurse. And she's just radiating this kind of calmness amidst all this hell. And that's what we've always aimed for. But it's really, really difficult. When my burying teenagers, when my stepdaughters were teenagers, was incredibly triggering. And being around a couple who were, our age, in which one of them had died, that was incredibly triggering. So I find grief. Yeah, I've always found it, and particularly as I've been doing it for 23 years, the accumulation of grief is really quite difficult. Bodies, I'm now completely used to, and I was fascinated by them when I first started, because they were the first dead bodies I'd ever seen, really, were the first funerals I was doing. But after a while, my focus did then switch to the kind of living. So there's nothing really that I find difficult about working with the dead physically, other than lifting people all the time, because it's a very, half of the job is very, very practical and physical. So I'm getting a bit knackered from carrying people backwards on a stretcher downstairs in little Dartmoor cottages. But it's the grief. It's being around a lot of grief. I'm not going to lie, it's hard to deal with, and it's got harder. It's got harder as the years have gone by.
It accumulates after you do this kind of work for a while.
It really does, yeah, absolutely. Because your work is more intense, I would say, than mine. There's a fulcrum between us. There's a slither of paper between us, really, because you're dealing with the family, all of that anticipatory grief and the build up to it, and the awful sadness when it happens, and then we are the people who comes in immediately afterwards, and they're still in that kind of state. So, yeah, it's grueling. It really is grueling. It used to buoy me up a lot more. I was younger and more enthusiastic and had more castles to storm then, establishment castles to storm. But yeah, I do find grief difficult, and I fear it.
So what's on your wish list for death care? Where would you like to see it in 10 years?
Well, part of what has happened in the UK with COVID is that a lot, and the lockdown, the pandemic lockdown, is that a lot more people have started to die at home. And lots of people think they want to die at home. And as you know, it's a really difficult thing because, if a husband's dying and the wife is the main caregiver, at some point, they're not really husband and wife anymore. They're a patient and a caregiver.
Yes.
So often those people who think they want to die at home don't end up dying at home. But because of COVID, they do die at home. And hospices have started to go out into the community a lot more. A little, like much more professional and skilled versions of what used to happen with kind of midwives and, who would help people give birth and help people die. It's really marvelous to see the sort of decentralization of hospices, which are still, there's shockingly few in this country, really. You would have thought there would be one in every town, really, and that they would be funded hopefully by our NHS, but of course they're not. So I would like to see that trend continuing of professional medical help going on for people who want to die at home, to fully support a family in a way which isn't traumatic and draining, but does give you that sense of not having to kind of be rushed off to a hospital or something like that. But one controversial thing I did float in the book, which I would love to see happen, and I think in some ways might really, is talking about the currently illegal drug MDMA, which had a huge impact over here with the rave and acid house. And of course, originally was when it was resynthesized in the States, it was used as to help couples as a kind of marriage guidance drug, because it lowers the fear response in your amygdala and helps you to talk about difficult things with a lot less pain and a lot more progress. And so that trials are now well underway and have been for quite a while in the States and in the UK about treating people with post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that, trauma of all sorts, with therapy and MDMA. And I floated rather kind of idly this idea in the book that that in my dream world, that would be used in a hospice situation, but not necessarily for the patient who's dying, because their medication will be finely tweaked by you people to the highest degree, but to help unknot long, tightly bound family issues which come up at the time when somebody dies. A lot of unresolved stuff is suddenly there to be seen. And I have this fanciful idea that therapeutic sessions with the family around the person who is dying, using MDMA could could transform the grief life of that family and really, really heal. It's a really radical out there idea, but in a dream world, that's what I would like to see.
Well, we get to wish what we want to wish for, so that's fine.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Rupert, how can my listeners find your book?
Hopefully it'll be splashed all over the New York Times, the LA Times. I don't know. It's it's called What Remains: Life, Death, and the Human Art of Undertaking, and it's published by Chelsea Green, who are a wonderful Vermont-based progressive publisher who've been going since the 80s. Of course, you can find it on the dreaded Mr. Bezos multinational, but which is unavoidable these days for anyone selling anything, including a book.
True.
But you can find it from the Chelsea Green website, and hopefully you'll be able to find it in bookshops all over America. Who knows?
Well, I'll have links to everything, including your TED Talk.
Thank you.
That you did, yes.
It's a bit bonkers, the TED Talk. A lot of this, some of it I go, what am I meaning there? I think in the TED Talk I call for almost a storming of the gates of heaven. It's my idea with any of these things, that with the book and with the TED Talk, are that I probably won't ever get an opportunity to say all of these things that I want to say. And so I'm going to speak my truths, however outrageous they might seem to other people or even inconceivable. So, yeah. I'm glad you enjoyed the TED Talk.
Oh, I did. And that's how change is made. That is how change is made. So use your voice. It's needed. Thank you so much, Rupert, for talking with me today and being on the show. It's been fascinating to get to know you.
Oh, thank you so much, Helen. I've absolutely loved it.
So now you see why Rupert is a radical undertaker. He's got some amazing ideas. And when I think about what we would consider unusual and radical in this day and age in 2023, what he's really talking about is back to the basics, back to the humanity, back to the human connection, back to the days of presence with someone who has died, presence for those rituals, presence in those rituals and the words that are spoken. He's shared his understanding of the etymology of the word undertaker and his goal to provide outside the normal type of undertaking. That's definitely been met, Rupert, for sure. Not promoting a fancy casket and keeping things natural, a willow basket, using flowers, etc. All very unusual in this day and age and how we take care of our dead. It was interesting. He talked about the importance of a family being involved in the planning of a funeral for someone they loved. He describes in the book What Remains that when his mother died, because she had delineated down to the last detail every single thing about her funeral, there really wasn't anything for him and his stepfather and his sisters to do. And he felt later on that wasn't a healthy situation, that it would have been better for them, for their grief, to be able to do those things and to plan those things. But he wasn't resentful of his mother's doing that. He said she was naturally a go-getter, an organized person. In fact, in the book, he says that on the papers where she wrote out all the instructions, she calls herself Bossy Boots at the top of the page. So she knew she was doing it. She knew she was large and in charge for this. But he talks about the importance of the family participating in some of the things. One of the points he made was about carrying the casket, carrying the coffin. So I take it, because he practices his business in the UK, that they have what we call pallbearers, casket bearers, funeral bearers, that work for the funeral home. He describes them as older men, fairly tall, dark suits. That's how he personifies them in the books. In the United States, of course, we have historically, traditionally had pallbearers that are chosen by the family members or friends who they would like to be part of this service. But Rupert says it's important for families to participate in the funeral, and he talks about them participating as casket bearers, that there's a memory that's created. And he called it a muscle memory because it's a physical action to carry a casket, but it creates a special memory in the heart and mind of someone who's participated that enhances their grief journey and makes it easier. When I asked Rupert about what he thought was the most challenging thing for him in his work as an undertaker, he immediately said it was the grief. So when you think about funeral care, funeral professions being care professions, it's very similar to the wear and tear that we experience as end-of-life workers, hospice professionals, end-of-life professionals. The wear and tear comes from that secondary grief, that compassion fatigue. And he says that's the most challenging thing for him. Makes sense. The work that we do, if you're empathic and you're doing it well, and they are wading in, he and his partner Claire are wading in and becoming very involved in the family and hearing about the person who's died, there is some of that grief that you take on. That secondary grief is very normal to do that. And I would dare say it's very healthy when it comes to providing services. But as a person, as an individual human, it's so important for Rupert and Claire to be able to take care of themselves. And I think his self-awareness is really, really great. The self-awareness of how grief is challenging for you in a care profession, that's half the battle right there. So I would encourage you to find his TED Talk. You can just Google it. It's a TEDx talk that was done, looks like in, I can't say the name of the city, but it's Totnes, Totnes. I'm not really sure, so forgive me, our listeners in the UK. And you can also read more about what the Green Funeral Company is doing over there in the UK at thegreenfuneralcompany.co.uk. And you can read about their journey with their green funeral services they're providing. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the Heart of Hospice.